Hi, everyone.
Hi.
It looks like we have some folks joining us. We're going to start in 1 minute, but in the interim, if you can turn your cameras off and your mics off, we're going to have cameras on for just the speaker once we start, and the mic on just for the speaker, and then folks can have an opportunity if they want during the Q&A to turn their camera on if they want to ask a question, and the same with the mic. But otherwise, we can get started. I see we have several people here, so it looks like we'll get started. So this is our first roundtable for this term. The PRI has hosted a number of roundtables to discuss various post-human related issues over the last few years. It's an opportunity for just a sort of dialogical exchange, a somewhat informal exchange to investigate the many facets of posthumanism, to also engage with scholars working on different areas within posthumanism, broadly defined, and to see what types of linkages we can make between our own thinking and the thinking of our colleagues, and what our appetites for sort of what else is out there concerning posthumanism. So the PRI is located at Brock University, which is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. The territory is governed by the two-row wampum agreement, the dish with one spoon agreement. And so we want to acknowledge the indigeneity of the land and of the people and the types of obligations and responsibilities we have on the land. We have some interesting speakers today. Obviously, for our roundtable, we have Sarah Best, who is a PhD student in religious studies at Wilfrid Laurier, so down the road from us at Brock. Professor Simone Bignall, who is a senior researcher in the Jumbunna Center for Indigenous Nations and Collaborative Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, so quite a far distance from us, in speaking to us from the future, from tomorrow morning. Professor David Fancy, professor of theater praxis in the Faculty of Dramatic Arts at Brock. Myself, I'm a PhD candidate in interdisciplinary humanities at Brock. And Maxwell Kennel, who is a PhD candidate in religious studies at McMaster, so also down the road from us. So for the roundtable, we have each of these speakers, and they will each give about a 10-minute presentation on an aspect of posthuman spirituality that is of interest to them. If you have questions, you can put your questions into the chat, and you can make a notation if you want to read that question aloud once we get to it, or if you want to have myself or David or someone read the question in your stead. We'll have about an hour of this question and answer where we can just informally discuss the themes broadly or ask specifics about any of the presentations. I also want to make a note that this event will be recorded and put on our PRI YouTube page. So if you don't want to have your likeness in the video, don't turn your camera on. If you don't want your voice in the recording, you can ask for someone to read your question aloud. But if there's nothing else, without further ado, we will turn it over to Sarah Best.
All right, so I will share my screen here. Okay, thank you, Mitch, for that introduction. Yeah, I'm Sarah. I am a first-year PhD student in religious studies at Wilfrid Laurier. And when approaching this question of post-human spirituality, I decided to look at a comparison of two different spiritualities in the contemporary world that I think overlap with a lot of post-human ideas and issues. And these are kind of the two divergent ways that my research has gone over the past few years. So I thought that it would be interesting to kind of bring them together in this. So So yeah, when starting with this idea of post-human spirituality, Francesco Ferrando has an article called "Humans Have Always Been Post-Human, a Spiritual Genealogy of Post-Humanism," where she basically starts from the idea that spirituality is a genealogical source of post-humanism because it gets at this core idea of non-dualism or post-dualism within post-humanity. It's this idea that in spirituality, there is no separation between the inner and outer worlds. There is a connectedness between self and other, and there is an ultimate interconnectedness at the heart of existence. This is kind of the post-human essence of spirituality for Ferrando. She also notes that spirituality is not the same thing as religion in this, and that religions themselves, while they can be hierarchical and very dualistic in some ways, the spiritual trends and doctrines within them may be post-human. In this article, she focuses largely on Eastern traditions and the idea of non-dualism in certain Eastern traditions, like Vedic traditions, such as Buddhism, or Vedic traditions and Buddhism as some examples. But for my presentation, I wanted to look at more examples, I guess, of post-human spirituality and ways in which we can see this in the contemporary world. So I wanted to focus on the new religious movement of Neopaganism that's arisen in the West within the past few decades, as well as the spiritual tradition of Inuit spirituality, so an indigenous tradition. And I think that we'll hear more about these kind of indigenous spiritualities and post-humanism with Dr. Bignall's presentation, but I'll just touch on it a little bit here in reference specifically to Inuit traditions. Yeah. So to start, neopaganism, just broadly, it's an umbrella term for a variety of different spiritual beliefs and practices. It's often polytheistic, but it can also be animistic, pantheistic. You can be a monotheist, a non-theist. It's very open what kind of neopagan spirituality actually is. At its core, it is a nature-based spirituality, so it's very much about celebrating the turning of the seasons and the relationships with the earth. And for some pagans, their view of the universe is that it's all made up of energies, forces, flows, and there is a very porous relationship between the sacred and profane because the divine is seen as being immanent within this world. It's been called Corpose Spirituality by Michael York, a pagan scholar, to refer to this kind of materiality of pagan religiosity. What's interesting is that within the context of kind of pagan spirituality and the ideas of magic that kind of go with this, rather than placing an emphasis on reason and rationality, what's important to neo-pagans is really this idea of the intuitive, imaginative, and highly embodied kind of ways of knowing and understanding the world. So it's very much about connections with the environment and being in one's body. And during my own kind of ethnographic research among neo-pagans in Scotland, one of my informants called this a form of bone knowing. So it's a form of knowing through your body rather than through the kind of rational intellect, and having the body be a interface for connecting with the material and spiritual world. Yes, so this kind of emphasis on materiality and the sensuous dimensions of the world, it shows a move away from the bounded rational subject to a more relational self that is a kind of self in connection. And this relates to a lot of Rosie Braidotti's work and the idea that the post-human subject is a enlarged kind of subjectivity, intersubjectivity, a connection between self and others, including non-human and earth others, and it kind of removes this optical of self-centered individualism. And just a quote from another one of my informants that kind of shows this is this idea that moving through the world with an embodied kind of pagan way of knowing, it removes the idea that the world is kind of out there apart from us, but rather something that's really right up with us all the time. And it creates this much more intimate, much more kind of connected sense of being and belonging in the world. So we can see here that there is an idea of kind of post-dualism within Neopagan spirituality as well. The sense that human beings are made up of the same stuff as everything else. They are made up of the same energies, the same materials, the same very kind of vibrant matter of the rest of the world. It's kind of all interconnected in that sense for pagans. And this also relates to Stacy Alamano's idea of transcorporeal reality, the idea that human beings are always enmeshed within the more than human, and Jane Bennett's notion of vibrant matter, the idea that bodies are all kin and that they're inextricably enmeshed within a dense network of relations, where every body is just a node in kind of a knotted world of vibrant matter. And I think that there are also kind of post-anthropocentric elements that can be seen in paganism as well, specifically in the fact that a lot of pagans take on a kind of relational, animistic kind of way of seeing the world, where agency is ascribed to the material world and everything is kind of interconnected. And material things have their own intentionality, their own kind of vibrancy and aliveness. And I especially saw this during my research in the way that Neopagans relate to trees. So they often see trees as being very like human-like, but also understanding that it's not, that they are not really trying to impose kind of like a humanness necessarily onto it. So this conversation between my two informants kind of shows that, where we impose kind of a humanness on trees in order to understand them, but then they're thinking that trees then have to impose a kind of treeness onto humans in order to understand us. So these two women were talking about what kind of trees they would be and how trees would see them, really. So it's this really kind of relational, kind of reciprocal understanding that I think it kind of moves past these like a human-centric understanding of nature that is really kind of at the core of posthumanism. But also in Ferrando's article, she notes that dualisms keep coming back, born out of their own ashes. This idea that dualisms are difficult to avoid, and within any spiritual tradition, we can never really fully avoid them in a sense. So there is no spiritual tradition that completely fits within a posthuman ontology. So within neopaganism, there is often a gap that exists between nature and culture. So neopaganism has roots in Romanticism and 19th century nature writing, and they often tend to have a very kind of romanticized view of nature as something that is separate from human culture and human development. So there's this kind of separation there. And a lot of neopagans are very suspicious of modern technology as something that is destroying nature in some way. There is like, I guess, a gap there with this like kind of post-human way of seeing things, because within the post-human view, it's understood that this idea that nature is separate from culture is really just itself a cultural construct, and that kind of separation doesn't actually exist. And then my kind of second interest, I guess, within religious studies, to kind of switch gears here, is Inuit spirituality. And within Inuit spirituality, I think that we can see a lot of post-human elements. There are these relationships between humans and non-humans that are based on reciprocity and respect, on the mutual need for survival. And humans and animals are very interconnected, porous, with fluid boundaries in this way of seeing the world. Human centrality is very kind of destabilized in this sense. And I think that it connects to Karen Barrett's idea of agental realism, wherein distinct agencies emerge through their mutual entanglement with one another. And within the Inuit tradition, there are a lot of stories of humans kind of having very, very fluid boundaries with animals, so kind of transforming into animals, and vice versa. And we can see this in Inuit creation myths. So this idea that both humans and animals lived on Earth, and there was really no difference between them in the beginning. They could transform into one another, and the boundaries were really very, very porous and fluid there. And my kind of specific interest in Inuit spirituality has been looking at video games, and specifically Never Alone, which is a Inuit video game from the Inupiat people of Alaska. So it was made in collaboration with this community, and it's a game that's based on the oral traditions and the animistic, shamanistic spirituality of the Inupiat people. Sorry, my voice is going out a little. And this is a game that really, it ties together the kind of material and the spiritual, and the technological and the biological, as kind of all these elements come together in the game. And I think kind of my interest in these games was seeing that how agency is not just centered on human players, but also arises through player, game, environment, and spirit interaction. So all of these things kind of interacting together as a digital assemblage that is kind of made up of all these various human and non-human elements. So in the game, players play partially as a fox, as a spirit helper fox. And here we can see an expansion of human subjectivity that includes the non-human. So human subjectivity becomes intersubjective, relational, and multiplicious as humans become these hybrid subjects that play as an animal and as a human being, and kind of the way that it's mediated through the technology. Also within the game, elements of the environment and their associated spirits are fundamentally alive. And they really demand kind of the respect of the human players. They drive the narrative and exert their agency onto players in such a way that players must learn to really respectfully kind of negotiate their way through the game with these elements. The game is really about kind of learning to work with the spirits and the environment around them in a very reciprocal, respectful way. And I think that here we can see elements of post-human spirituality in that. The game is really a meeting of technology and spirituality. And the traditional world views of the Inupiat are expressed through modern technology here. And unlike, I think, in some elements of neopaganism, we see that this like divide between the natural and the cultural starts to kind of fade away. So in conclusion, I guess we can see some post-human elements in both of these spiritual traditions, one that has been around for thousands of years, and one that's only decades old. We can see the spiritual genealogy of post-humanism that Ferrando references in Inuit spirituality. And we can also see how new religions can be potentially post-human and have potential post-human elements. And yeah, thank you for that. I'm sorry if I rushed through it a little bit, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. Next we'll have Simone. So if she wants to turn her camera on and share her screen.
Can you see me? I have turned my camera on.
Yes.
Yeah, can see you.
Okay. Can you all see that as well?
Yeah.
Okay. I think this is working. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Sarah, for that excellent discussion. That was very, very interesting. I'd like to also thank you very much, Mitch, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Adelaide in Australia. And Adelaide is now built upon the lands of the Kaurna people, who are the Indigenous people of the Adelaide Plains. And I'd like to acknowledge before I start that the ongoing challenges that the Kaurna people have in having their sovereignty recognised and acknowledged. So Since this seminar is about spirituality broadly conceived, let me begin by signalling that my own conception of spirituality is based in my commitment to a Spinozist ontology and ethics, and that informs not only my academic thinking, but also my material practices in the world. So a Spinozist ontology and ethics depends upon understanding how there is a kind of parallel and not a dualism between mind and body. So the mind is the idea of the body. How one exists then as a physical and relational entity, and one's corporeal actions in the world correspond with the idea one has of oneself in relation to others and the world that binds us. And the more adequate this idea becomes over time, the more real my existence becomes. So my take on post-human spirituality draws upon Spinozist ethics, but also upon Foucault and his work on ethos, which I think is quite Spinozist in its orientation as well. So Foucault explains how, at its most general level, history, so the formation and transformation of society, is caused by a human disposition to be sociable, to enter into relations of power. This somewhat unremarkable claim becomes interesting, though, when Foucault highlights Kant's comments on enlightenment and maturity and suggests that sociability takes a historically particular form when individuals identify with what he calls a certain attitude. And he defines this as a mode of, oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we'll just make sure that everybody else kindly has their mics off, and Camilla, you can go in and manage that too, and then we'll just make sure that there's no more feedback. But yeah, we can totally hear you.
Okay, so Foucault defines an ethos or attitude, as I put up there on the PowerPoint, as a mode of relating to contemporary reality, a voluntary choice made by certain people, in the end, a way of thinking and feeling, a way of acting and behaving that at one and the same time marks a relation of belonging and presents itself as a task. A bit, no doubt, he says, like what the Greeks called an ethos. So when individuals identify with a particular attitude, they position themselves in readiness for a particular kind of being and relation. And Foucault points to Kant's discussion of the Enlightenment and maturity as a way of suggesting that historical events such as the Enlightenment, or in our case, I think, the shift towards post-humanism, are significant precisely because they offer a moment of transparency in which individuals are able to access the virtual kind of foundation of their actual or existing practices, forms of being and relationality, and subsequently to subject these to critique, and potentially also to redefinition. So historical discontinuities like the Enlightenment, or like the break we are seeing currently in humanist traditions and a shift towards post-humanism, signal epochal attitude shifts marked by events such as pandemic or climate crisis, in which societies are able to modify their structures of relationship according to novel modes of social disposition. So this is how I understand spirituality, broadly conceived, as a kind of ethos or attitude in relation to a present moment. So for me, spirituality or ethos is a way of being mindfully present, which involves a critique of the present moment with regard to its permanent potentiality for being otherwise. So this awareness of the permanent potentiality of a present state of affairs involves a kind of mindfulness of their quality of emptiness or their openness, which is something we see in many Eastern religions, but it's also something we see in Western philosophies, particularly, I think, the continental tradition. Agamben, for example, talks about what it is to be contemporary in these terms. So then, what is a post-human spirit, an ethos, or an attitude of post-humanism? So I think, for me, a post-human spirit or a post-human ethos involves an attitude of critique that's addressed to the present, which, it's a moment of crisis, which has been and remains significantly defined by modern Western humanism. I think it's also, for me, an ethos of relationality, which, similar to what Sarah was talking about, counters the divisions and associated hierarchies emphasized in modern humanism. the divisions between genders, between human and non-human life, between cultural or different cultural modes of human existence. And this, as Sarah also pointed out, corresponds with a kind of ethos of interconnection and interrelationality, reciprocity. So for me, then, a post-human spirit is also an ethos of relationality that, instead of hierarchy or the opportunity for dominance, looks for shared benefit and the potential for relations to offer mutual enhancement and reciprocity. So this quality of post-human spirituality, or a post-humanist ethos of positive reciprocal relationality, aligns in many, many ways with Indigenous spiritualities. But post-human spirituality, I think, cannot be considered the same as Indigenous spirituality or spiritualities. Humanism is a tradition quite specific to the modern Western philosophical lineage. And here I think I would depart from those perspectives that say that, you know, humanity has always been post-human in Indigenous philosophies. I think that Indigenous spiritualities are not post-humanist because they have never previously been humanist. Most Indigenous philosophical systems that I know of emphasize how the nature culture continuums in which they participate are in significant ways human actioned. In the majority of Indigenous worldviews, human life has a specific agency and responsibility in relation to non-human life. But overall, Indigenous philosophies are non-humanist in their quality. So, for example, we can see this in the wording of the first principle of the treaty that binds the United League of Indigenous Nations, which says that the Creator has made us part of and inseparable from the natural world around us. This principle also says that this truth binds us together and gives rise to a shared commitment to care for, conserve and protect the land, air, water and animal life within our usual, customary and, that's sort of cut off, traditional boundaries. As another example, this premise that we see in the first statement of the treaty, it expresses general principles common across Indigenous worldviews and self-understandings, so relationality, reciprocal generosity, and respectful care. These really key ontological and ethical commitments and concepts are articulated in a great diversity of ways by culturally diverse Indigenous philosophies, but they have a kind of commonality to them. So, for example, we see in the Huayat people of Vancouver Island, these people consider themselves governed by three core principles. There's the principle, I'm going to say this wrong, but Hishuk Sawak, which is the idea that everything is one, interconnected, interdependent, and there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between the people, the land, and the wider worlds in a physical, spiritual, and a social sense. The second principle, U'athlak, which means taking care of present and future generations and of the resources provided by the land and the natural world. And finally, Isak, which is relational respect, entailing both personal and collective respect for the community and its people, traditional knowledge, the natural world, the metaphysical world, and other people and communities, including the global community. In the Southern Hemisphere, the Maori experience of existence as a vibrant and effective matter is, shares a lot of similarities with the kind of thinking we see in Jane Bennett, for example. It describes a relational view of the world where we are called into being through our relationships, through the interaction with kin, genealogies and events. Rocks, rivers, birds, plants, mountains, animals and oceans, for Maori, all possess a genealogy, and the divine genealogical order of Pakapapa extends through eons to a common genealogical origin, which is Io, the creator of the cosmos. So Wakapapa means that everything is connected through shared networks and processes of creative becoming. Maori, or striving to persevere in being, which is something we also see in the Spinozan concept of conatus, is the animating force of all being and becoming. This vitality continually grows and unfolds as reciprocal relationships become increasingly complex and rich and diverse also in manner or dignity. However, for Maori, the Maori of a being can be affected by the ways in which it is engaged with or the ways with which it is treated by others. For example, the level of Maori contained by a river can be determined by its capacity to maintain and support life. Through ill treatment, such as pollution, the Maori of the river can decline, which will in turn mean that its capacity to support the life around it will also decline. So Maori ethics then involves the practice of Maori enhancing positive relationships with human communities and between humans and non-human entities. So for example, a positive relationship between humans and a river would be evidenced by human land management practices that enable a river to enhance and maintain, or maintain and enhance its Maori, which would result in its life generating capacities being maintained. In this way, the Maori of the river is grown or maintained through ensuring that its life generating vibrancy is not diminished, but is allowed and encouraged to flourish. Simultaneously, the Maori of people is maintained through the provision of food and other resources to the humans from the river. So when key Maori values of kinship, reciprocity, hospitality, and respect for life guide human behaviour, the Maori of both human and non-human life is more likely to be maintained. And in turn, the life-generating and life-giving capacity and sustainability of these entities is also enhanced. However, for Maori and for all Indigenous people that I know, this capacity to put positive reciprocal relations into practice depends upon a power of governance as well, a power of sovereignty. Having the power to give effect to values within a place, having the power to guide land management practices according to the relational values that maintain or enhance the Maori of the land, rivers and coastal areas, the sky, the air, the people, the animals. All of this requires a power to make that effective, a kind of sovereignty. And this is how I understand that many, many Indigenous peoples understand their sovereignty as a kind of consubstantiality and the power to make the relationships that define one positive and reciprocal and generous, if you like. Now, I think this quality of Aboriginal philosophies, Maori, Australian Aboriginal philosophies, Canadian First Nations philosophies, Northern American Indigenous philosophies, Taiwanese philosophies, Indigenous philosophies, I think they share much in common with continental post-humanism that similarly conceives of humanity as being responsibly and responsively constituted in inextricable relations with the non-human world. And this then brings me to my final point, which is that I think that post-humanism entails decolonisation. It's an essential part of a post-humanist attitude or ethos. A post-human ethos is for me also necessarily a decolonial, or what I would call an ex-colonial ethos. So ex-colonial is a contraction of the phrase exit from colonialism. It's a term that I've coined to sort of capture better the idea of a break with colonization. And I think in some ways, post-humanism isn't a break with humanism. It's a critical perspective on humanism, but still allows a place for human agency in a more responsible and interconnected ways. Nonetheless, a post-human ethos is for me also necessarily a decolonial or an ex-colonial ethos. Indigenous perspectives align with post-humanist worldviews, but after colonisation, I think it's really crucial that non-Indigenous people, such as myself, refrain from appropriating Indigenous perspectives or claiming them as their own. So Indigenous knowledges, traditions, sovereignties, I think we must affirm that these are not up for grabs in the new post-humanist world, as we scramble to define the territory of the new posthumanism. Posthuman spirituality involves what I think is actually an ethos of intercultural alliance. It's a critical ethos of intercultural alliance after modern Western humanism, after imperialism, which in every way counters the humanist practices of appropriation and division that have shaped the present condition in which we find ourselves. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Simone. Next we have David.
Thank you very much. Share. And thank you very much, especially to Simone and Sarah for those really very subtle, illuminating presentations, which I'm still quite stuck on, but I will jump into my work with the aspiration of being able to come back and engage in further discussion with those colleagues. So my presentation is entitled Dowsing and Posthuman Spirituality. I'm going to begin with a claim which is essentially a sort of a Simondonian provocation just to get us going. All spirituality is posthuman insofar as spirituality is the relation between the individual and the pre-individual. Whether it be via transduction, structuration, complex morphogenesis, schematization, or any other way of describing the coming together of the pre-individual qualities to constitute the individual. So no matter how you describe this process of coming together, the process of this coming together, or ontogenesis, provides a container for all of these pre-individual aspects to endure within the determined, yet still highly mutable or metastable individual. In the case of human spirituality, because it would be short-sighted to presume that the anthropos is the whole soul home of the spiritual, various human and other than human relationalities endure and unfold in what in transcendent shorthand in our Western liberal tradition we call the human. I'm going to use that as a sort of shorthand for the species for the moment, so brackets around that. Put differently, other than human stuff comes together to form the basis of the human. Individual humans remain connected to the world beyond themselves via the very reality that they are made up of this other than human stuff. Humans are always in a position to be able to access what is beyond them because they are in fact constituted by what is beyond them. A spiritual practice is therefore always already a de facto post-human practice. So this sort of set of claims from Simondon to get me going. Yearnings for the spiritual are essentially yearnings to escape the more restrictive aspects of the identitarian capture of the human. As humans, major questions around the spiritual become therefore, and I have a list, how do we actively access the pre-individual? What is the nature of that accessing? What is the nature of the kinds of connection foregrounded and realized through that work? What is the nature of the pre-individual that's accessed? What is a spiritual practice that can permit this intensified relationality? So of course, there's as many answers to these questions as there are humans yearning for spiritual experience. Today, and this is sort of a departure from what I would usually be doing, not talking about my own practice, but I'm doing that in this context. I'll theorize in a very introductory fashion my own lifelong practice of dowsing or geomancy from this post-human perspective. Before I jump into that, I'll just say that today's conceptualization is part of a broader project of mine around the interactions between the many pre-individual subtle energies that constitute the human on one hand, and how these interact with contemporary wireless communications technologies and their electromagnetically enabled networks, and in turn how all of this speaks to the broader potential for techno-capital's well underway capture and vibratory entrainment of life on the planet. So what I'm introducing briefly here today, from some perspectives, I understand to be a resistant response, a post-human vibratory spiritualities as resistance to capture and entrainment by resonance captures and excesses. But what is dowsing? The typical figure of the dowser is one who divines for underground water sources, as well as naturally occurring geomagnetic or geoelectrical forces. The figure of the dowser is equally in evidence across a range of traditional cultures, including Gallic, Norman, Egyptian, Indigenous, Celtic, and Celtic cultures, whose many standing stones, for example, the Celtic cultures, are generally placed in alignment with naturally occurring beneficial subtle energy lines. Chinese feng shui, which initially had nothing to do with about where to situate IKEA furniture in a two-bedroom walk-up, was concerned initially with the avoidance of unbeneficial geopathic stress lines, geopathic or sickness from the earth, and in turn, the cultivation of beneficial earth energy. Some more images of figures of dowsing. The work of the dowser is the work of pursuing the ability to mobilize connective and affective relationships of different speeds, modulations, and intensities with other bodies, such as the body of the earth, bodies of water, whatever one is seeking to connect with, while simultaneously and actively disidentifying with the identitarian premise and corporeal practices of traditional humanism. So going back to the invocation of Spinoza made by Simone, clearly resonances or references to Spinoza here. Research and my own extensive training within my own Celtic and Gallic traditions, with a dozen years or so spent living in Ireland, Scotland, and France, as well as collaboration with Indigenous colleagues here on Turtle Island and elsewhere. These have provided me with an extensive set of training practices that I now teach to others. This is a much broader conversation, but suffice it to say that the skills of the dowser or geomancer revolve around working with and projecting one's own subtle energy systems into the subtle energy bodies of other entities. Or two, the simultaneous mobilization of a range of different brain activities in the beta, delta, alpha, and theta wave ranges simultaneously again. And three, vibratory engagements via voice as it interacts with complex symbologies. So I'm going to show just a very short video to concretize this. What I demonstrate here briefly, I have been able to teach 80% of humans to do within about 45 minutes. So let's see if this works. It's me downstairs in the studio a little earlier, so apologies if the audio and the framing isn't great. Let's see if we can pull up the play button. Okay, so one can use coat hangers to douse with. One sets one's intention, and I'm going to walk towards you, or walk towards us, looking with the intention to find unbeneficial geopathic stress. I walk forward and I ask these to cross when I arrive at that. I find a line here, they cross of their own accord, I step off the line, oh, it's a wide one, and there it's clean again. Okay, and that happens, we see there's the line, and off the line. I move over here, it's the same thing, these lines run for a while, there it's the first one, the second one that I just found, and so forth. We also find them in this direction. Unbeneficial line. Okay, unbeneficial line. Running this way. I change my intention and look for a beneficial energy vortex. Points towards it. And then it will spin in a circle. Here's the beneficial energy vortex. It's a small one. The energy drops off. And then I can look for water. I shift my intention to seek water and nothing happens. There's no underground water. Oops, there's some underground water. Okay? So, again, a very rapid sort of demonstration using coat hangers. I wanted to use something quite vernacular. This video demonstrates a detecting capacity. Equally, if not more important, is the work of manipulating or working with and collaborating with these energies. Next steps would be for me to show you how to amplify these earth energy vortices, connect them with one another, how to amplify and bring into conversation the energy fields of trees, even hibernating ones, how to communicate with plants, animals, minerals, clouds, how to intervene in and heal human bodies through subtle energy clearing and amplification, and so on and so forth. So indeed, before I close with more of the work of conceptualizing these geomantic practices, I'll disclose that my own initiatory experience that demanded that I become very familiar with and capable with subtle energy management in myself and the many other than human entities that comprise those around me. Heavy metal poisoning and other factors earlier in life led to total environmental illness, from which I've largely recovered, fortunately. But this meant that I had zero tolerance for any form of human-made electromagnetic emissions for some years. This led in turn to many years living alone outdoors in the Canadian winter, the initiatory experience of endurance and healing, during which I was forced to develop subtle energy management and intensification for the purposes of simple survival. So returning to the work of conceptualization, a little slide here. Oh, see if I can move this over there. Returning to the work of conceptualization, it's clear that the epistemological moorings of this type of work demand evidentiary bases that exceed the typical scientism of so much late capital knowledge production. Instead, this work requires migrating from 18th century five senses empiricism, which haunts so much humanist knowledge production and epistemology, and instead a movement towards a post-human gnoseology premised on a differentiated understanding of somatic, spiritual, energetic practices. Various philosophical modes of intuition, from the Bergsonian, the Husserlian, to more recent iterations of this conceptual development and procedure, continue to need to be developed, I feel, in the context with this type of practice. This form of conceptual migration is part of the initiatory rite on a philosophical level, initiated by the intersecting crises of colonial aftermaths and ecocide, invoking humans' need to understand the pre-individual subtle energy that co-constitutes all phenomena. An initiatory rite that I argue in my larger project is essential to avoid the insistent proto-fascist inherences and end of philosophy embedded within advances around techno-capital. There are, of course, many ways of proceeding to pursue this conceptual disidentification from the identitarian. Conceptual moves that can be harnessed and intensified to help think through the work of geomancy, dowsing, and subtle energy manipulation. One is to pursue what Deleuze and Guattari describe as becoming imperceptible, a more extensive version of the intensivities released via another of their well-known processes, that of becoming animal. The imperceptible, they suggest, is the imminent end of becoming, its cosmic formula, and becoming imperceptible means many things. At a basic level, becoming imperceptible is about rendering oneself open to the compositions of the other bodies making up the world. A becoming every body, everything making the world a becoming, is to world, to make a world or worlds, in other words, to find one's proximities and zones of indiscernibility. This radical act of curiosity, openness to an auto-expropriation of rigid boundaries of inside-outside, is, they suggest, to be present at the dawn of the world. From this conceptual vantage, then, dowsing and geomancy, as they're described from the roots of Western cultures, and related shamanic practices, as they're described in indigenous cultures, make for an energetic becoming imperceptible as post-human spiritual practice. They state, one has made a necessarily communicating world through becoming imperceptible, because one has suppressed in oneself everything that prevents us from slipping between things and growing in the midst of things. In closing, I'll say I have a working group of vibrational practitioners from a range of traditions, Western, non-Western, indigenous, that I'm training into my own practice and collaborating with. This training can readily be done by distance. So if anyone present would like to join this group to either learn or trade skills you've already developed, or knows someone who might like to join, please get in touch. I'm specifically seeking collaborators for a subset of this group called the Posthuman Spirituality and Subtle Energy Working Group, devoted to the theorization and practice and these kinds of areas. I passionately believe that this is just some rhetoric here, but this is an authentic, it comes from an authentic place. I passionately believe that the survival of our and many other species' health and futures are very much bound up with this type of pursuit, best undertaken in the collective settings that can only amplify potency. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. So I'm next, so I will share my screen as well. So my presentation is just going to give a very brief discussion of the manifestation of posthumanism in the work of Buradati, Bennett, and Barad. I see I'm being transcribed in real time. I don't know why that is, so we'll just let that go. So my presentation is titled Let's Get Spiritual, a little riff on Olivia Newton-John. In the Posthuman, Buradati talks about what she calls the posthuman post-secular turn. So this is not the central aspect in the posthuman, but she provides a discussion of humanism and posthumanism in a religious or spiritual context. So to that end, she quotes Gray, who says humanism is the transformation of the Christian doctrine of salvation into a project of universal human emancipation. So we can understand in a European context, at least, a transition from religiosity, Christian religiosity, to Enlightenment humanism as a secularizing process. So according to Buradati, again, humanism becomes associated with secularity. Secularity becomes associated, or a hallmark actually, of scientific and Western supremacy in this same vein. So we have distinctions being made, some of these dualisms being made that were spoken about earlier by Sarah and others, between East and West, associated on an axis of religiosity or secularity. There are some left responses to these Enlightenment dogmas that Buradati discusses in the Posthuman and elsewhere, including her article in Spite of the Times, where she talks about heterodox religious movements amongst feminists, amongst post-colonial scholars, African-American feminists, and others that are in some ways a response to these dominant Enlightenment dogmas that seek to sideline any type of religiosity or spiritual practice through a supposed supremacy of secularity. She says that this is a natural, has a natural affinity with the material feminism, posthumanism, feminist science studies, which has broadened questions in the sciences to sort of an ontological issue of life itself. And so questions of life itself in the sciences naturally leads one to spiritual questions, according to Buradati. So there's a quote from the Posthuman that I won't read now for the sake of time, but in Transpositions, so a few years before the Posthuman, Buradati articulates what she calls a nomadic spirituality. And so this is a type of posthuman spirituality that seeks to avoid some of those Enlightenment humanist dogmas and find a spirituality that's affirmative, philosophically, ethically, and things of that nature. So for her, a nomadic spirituality is non-theistic, posthumanist, non-Christian. It's an embedded and embodied politics of location that's affirmative and that's oriented towards virtual futures. So following in this Deleuzian concept, this Deleuzian frame that David and Simone discussed, it's about, for her, becoming worlds, becoming imperceptible, towards a sort of social horizon of hope in the future. And there's a lot of similarities to be made between the post-human nomadic spirituality of Brer and the vibrant matter of Bennett, which was discussed by Sarah as well. So in vibrant matter, Bennett provides a distinction between soul vitalism and critical vitalism, the former being a type of Christian animism, in the latter, the work of folks like Bergson. So for Bennett, she writes, the vital materialist affirms a figure of matter as an active principle and a universe of this lively materiality that is always in various states of congealment and diffusion. Materialities, gosh, I have a lot of typos in this paragraph. Materialities that are active and creative without needing to be experienced or conceived as partaking in divinity or purposelessness. So for her, a vibrant materiality beyond critical vitalism, but a vital materiality, a vibrant matter, is about this liveliness of matter, an agental nature of matter beyond purposefulness that's organized by a divinity. It's beyond the scope of this sort of soul vitalism that she associates, like I said, with sort of Christian animism, but then appropriated by Christian conservatives to animate embryonic tissue or fetuses and things like that. So vibrant materiality is very central in a philosophy of modern enchantment, which Brer discusses in an earlier text. And so she demarcates three types of enchantment. The first is this Christian cosmological enchantment in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And some of that texture and feel is then, brought back to life in Christian conservatism. You have a Kantian enchantment, which is a somewhat secularized version of the former, but allows for some instances of enchantment between mind and nature, mind and body. And then this modern Deleuzian enchantment that we've seen David and Simone talk about a bit, becoming worlds, becoming imperceptible. And so that links up really nicely with Brer nomadic spirituality. Of this Deleuzian enchantment, she writes, this Deleuzian kind of enchantment is one where wonders persist in a rhizomatic world without intrinsic purpose or divinity, or assuming the telos or God. For Deleuze, enchantment resides in the spaces where nature and culture overlap, where becomings happen among humans, animals, and machines. So this is an enchanted modernity, reality that is very much spiritual and gets to those questions of the meaning of life, what life is, that Brer highlighted as a contribution of feminist science studies, material feminism, and things like that. So there's lots of resonances to be seen between Brer and Bennett. I think there are some resonances and some dissonances with Barad as well. So Sarah mentioned Barad in her theory of agental realism, for example. So for Barad, our world is interactive. So every being, everything, every experience is made through an entangled, immanent relation with of matter and meaning. So everything is entangled in an immanent material fashion, and then in some ways becomes disentangled through agental cuts. Sort of this is where sort of constructivism comes into play. So this is fashioned from the quantum physics philosophy of Bohr, and is a diffractive reading of material feminism, feminist theory, queer theory, and quantum physics. So this is part of a methodology from the idea of diffraction in physics, where matter and things bump up against one another and create new patterns and open up new potential virtual futures. So Barad highlights to a broader extent her what she calls theology, politics, science, and an extended essay in this collection, Entangled Worlds. And so in this diffractive way, she connects her reading of physics, quantum physics, material feminism with the historical materialism of Benjamin. So she provides a diffractive reading of feminist agental realism with his historical materialism to blast apart the notion that science is an independent field of thought driven only by empirical findings or devoid of any metaphysical, theological, or political commitments. And so Barad, in many ways, her posthuman spirituality is quite similar, but she's, I think, open more so than Barad and Bennett to theology proper, religiosity proper. For example, she talks about Judaism and the Kabbalah extensively in this essay. So those are sort of the down and dirty three instances of posthuman spirituality as manifested in these three mothers of posthumanism. And they're all quite similar, but there are some dissonances as well. So with that, I'll invite Maxwell to do the final presentation before we have a question and answer.
Right. Well, thanks everyone. The way I'm going to do mine is just a little different. I'm going to paste into the chat a link to a text version because some of what I'm doing is a little bit dense. So first, thanks for having me on this panel. So for my contribution, I'm going to just say a little bit about my forthcoming book, Post-Secular History, Political Theology, and the Politics of Time. So among other things, the book approaches the main themes of this panel by focusing on what it means to be post in the first instance, and then by examining religious and theological ways that the prefix post is configured and used. So the book is primarily concerned with the prefix post that precedes the post-secular, but I think it can also be relevant to the conversation on posthumanism and postmodernism. And so I'm going to make some connections with posthumanism at the end of this presentation, hopefully in a way that leads into our discussion. So my book project advances a critique of certain ways of dividing up time and history. So I draw from the field of political theology, and through that I'm concerned with how theological and political ideas combine to form powerful legitimation strategies. And I also draw from thinkers who work in the politics of time. And from them, I'm concerned with how temporal and historical terms are periodized. So how historical categories like ancient, medieval, and modern, and temporal categories, past, present, and future, how these categories are divided up and used in value-laden ways. So my book undertakes a critique of theopolitical periodization, and I focus on how that prefix post that precedes the post-secular, I focus on how that prefix implies some problematic relationships with what it precedes. So specifically, I want to challenge uses of the term post-secular where that prefix is used to imply possession, novelty, freedom, and instrumentality. So I'm going to walk through each of those. That's my left. We have a post-human interruption here. One moment. I'm in the room with two poodles. So over the course of the 6 chapters of the book, while covering some thinkers in and around political theology, I attempt to dispute and question this idea that the post-secular, that term, can honestly be used or helpfully be used in these ways. So rather than possession, novelty, freedom, and instrumentality, I argue that this prefix post is better used to name complex and contextual mediations between historical and temporal terms. So over the course of the book, I try to analyze and point beyond these limited ways of thinking about the post-secular. So in the first chapter, I extend my thesis that periodizations of time and history are best characterized as theopolitical economizations, that apportion meaning and value to certain terms at certain times. For example, making some things seem present and relegating some other things to the past. And so at the same time, I attempt to resist thinking that any post term could really fix upon or possess its object enough to definitively surpass it or overcome it. So that's my critique of possession. I'm not sure that prefix post can really hold on to what it wants to overcome. After that, I look to the implicit claim of novelty in the prefix post that precedes the post-secular. So rather than thinking that the post-secular entanglements of religion and secularity that we see today, rather than thinking they're fundamentally new, I look back to a 17th century group called the Collegians, who met in the major urban centers of the Dutch Republic. Spinoza attended several of these groups. So by looking back on these interesting groups that combined spiritualism and rationalism at the dawn of the Enlightenment, I aim to challenge this notion that our current conflicts of values between secularity and religiosity are as new as some modern thinking would suggest. So then in chapter 3, I turn to freedom. I argue that the prefix post cannot fully or completely perform this radical break that would free itself from what it precedes. So I draw from the work of a Jewish philosopher named Jacob Taubes, and I suggest that we ought to understand history as something both free for us to use for the purposes of freedom, and something that's also radically free from instrumental use. So drawing from Taubes' dissertation, Occidental Eschatology, I argue that history is something that we can resource for the cause of emancipation, but something that will always refuse to be straightforwardly used. Then in my 4th chapter, I turn to this interplay between meaning and meaninglessness. So I depart from the broad scope of what I've been doing so far in the first 3 chapters, and I look to the politics of autobiography and narrative. So by comparing how narratives are periodized in Augustine's Confessions and Nietzsche's Zarathustra, I want to suggest that post-secular entanglements and mediations are more robust when they avoid making meaning or meaninglessness compulsory. So instead of seeing meaning as something that we need to wholly accept or refuse, I want to make room for both the providential and teleological pilgrimage of an Augustine and the wandering and aimlessness of Zarathustra's ascents and descents. That's the 4th chapter, but the 5th chapter of the book project is most relevant to our panel. And in it, I turn to posthumanism and I look at the limits of categorically distinguishing between humanity and technology. And here's where I sympathize with David Will's suggestion that there's no way to think back on a historical origin point before humanity and technology were enmeshed. So the 6th chapter focuses on Bernard Stiegler's invention of the human in Technics and Time, and his contrasting of Promethean foresight and Epimethean hindsight. So in that chapter, I developed this notion that periodization, which broadly construed, I just take to mean the division of temporal and historical terms, the political and theological division. I argue that it is a theopolitical act that economizes and apportions meaning. But I also argue at the same time that periodizations that use the prefix post, they perform a kind of technological or technical time management, a kind of technical extension that makes and crafts through instrumental relationships between means and ends. So through a reading of Stiegler and others, I conceive of the periodizing gesture in the prefix post as a kind of technical prosthesis that's open to many distortions, like that of instrumentality, Eurocentrism, and the capitalist capture of time. Then in the 6th chapter, I look to a radical Christian theologian named Dorothy Zola, and I focus on her phenomenology of waiting. So for Zola, certain ways of waiting and anticipating make expectation irreducible to experience. They can serve as a way of overcoming some of the problems of both optimism and pessimism. I think part of Zola's challenge, and we can talk about that in discussion, I think she serves to challenge some of the progressive or progressivist inclinations in the post prefix without compromising the desire for a better future. And then in conclusion, I continue my effort to provide some remedial strategies for the aporias of the post-secular. And I look to Eric Auerbach's figural way of connecting origins and ends in figures and fulfillments. But at the very end, I've just written up a brief postscript that I think draws out some of the relevance of this work for our current political moment. So given the serious limitations of the post prefix, its relations of possession, novelty, freedom, and instrumentality, and its implied overcoming of the past, I think it should strike us that we're now hearing about a post-COVID and post-Trump world. So the Trump presidency and the COVID-19 pandemic are two world historical events that are like 9/11 or the fall of the Berlin Wall, that they're going to serve as periodizing markers for dividing time and history into a before and an after. So in this context, I hope my work can help us, help remind us that we can never move past the past in such definitive terms. The past always returns in symptoms and memories that make the past ever present. And so what matters is how that return is configured or received. So although post designations have limits, I do see plenty of potential in the prefix post for discussing problems of time and history in the tensions between religion and secularity. My overall approach is to use the prefix post to refer to mediations and complex entanglements rather than overcoming and succession. So the question which you may be asking then is, how does this bear on posthumanism? And I'm just entering into the wider discourse of posthumanism beyond some of my work on Stiegler. But it's a complex and multifaceted field of study that I think admits to no programmatic summary statement or synthesis. I think that's part of its beauty. But I do notice that the term posthuman consistently names attempts to move beyond anthropocentrism and species superiority. But movements past or beyond always have a complex relationship with the past that they seek to pass. So in my attempt to articulate a post-secular history that reminds post-secular thinkers of the politics of history and analyzes how that term post-secular performs historical mediations, I've assumed that the prefix post implies these relationships of possession, novelty, freedom, and instrumentality. But my questions, I guess, for our discussion are, can the same be said for the posthuman? Does posthumanism or the posthuman employ similar periodizations as the post-secular? How might that prefix that precedes the post-secular be an instrumental form of periodization that troubles our relationships between technology and humanity? Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Maxwell. So we have about 45 minutes for question and answer. And so if anyone has a question they would like to ask themselves, they can raise their hand and I will call on them. If they have a question they would like to have someone read in their stead, they can enter it into the chat box and I will read it and put it to our speakers.
And let's have all the speakers come back.
Yeah, so we'll have our speakers turn their video back on. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can have your camera on if you would like.
I might jump in and just make a sort of question observation, if that's okay, Mitch.
Sure.
Simone, thanks for the introduction of the ex-colonial, right? I'm thinking, I'm trying to remember the name of the scholar who did some really interesting writing about sort of the post and post-colonial, not necessarily referencing the temporal, but an engagement with the colonial. But that doesn't, still, as Maxwell's been saying with this particular sort of prefix, there's a temporality that's kind of invoked with the notion of the post. So I'm wondering, Simone, just in response to some of Maxwell's observations about the potential problematizations around this kind of historiography, what kind of turbulences or interesting sort of results or discussions with colleagues or other thinkers have you had around the introduction of the ex-colonial and a very specific set of valences that it introduces outside of the temporal?
Yeah, Max, I really loved your paper. You know, we have lots of research interests in common, I think, and part of that is, as David's just suggested, the idea of, you know, my idea that there needs to be a different kind of prefix to discuss what comes after colonialism, when we actually, in Australia, certainly still live in a colonial present. So I'll come back to your question in a minute about how the reception of the term.
Yeah.
So when I came up with the term ex-colonial, which was in 2014, I was really troubled by the same kinds of problems that Maxwell talked about in his paper and presumably in the book, which I'm looking forward to reading. And that is that, you know, we need a different understanding about what it means to exist in the world after crisis without thinking that that crisis can be surpassed. So the prefix X is better for me in my work because I use it in the same sense that I would use to describe a relationship, like an ex relationship. It's something that that I've been entangled with. It still defines me. I can't break myself from it because it's constitutive. And yet it's, I've made a conscious decision to separate myself from that relationship that defined me in the past and to recreate myself on a new footing or a new kind of basis of relations with others and with particular others in particular. So I think for me, the prefix X is more critical than the prefix post, but at the same time, it is sensitive to the idea that the past can't be surpassed. It's necessary to break with the past on the understanding that that break can never be complete or absolute. Yeah, so in terms of reception, it's generated a huge amount of interest, particularly amongst my Indigenous colleagues, because for Indigenous peoples philosophically, you know, temporality isn't something that proceeds in a linear fashion either. There's not past, present, and future. In fact, the past and the future coexist with the present moment in a very similar way to the way that Bergson, for example, conceives of the coexistence of temporalities, and Deleuze after him as well. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question for Simone. Do you see the prefix X having a more spatial and maybe less temporal resonance, or would you want to divide it up that way? I appreciate your comment that, you know, the past and future are co-instantiated in the present in interesting ways, and this has led some thinkers to try to move away from prefixes like post or neo or pre. Would you set yourself off from those explicitly, or does X try to negotiate and mediate with them in different ways?
I'm not sure. I think probably more negotiated than oppositional or separate from, I think. Although, you know, this is just off the top of my head and I'd have to think more about it. In terms of the spatiality of what it means to be X something, I think if it's an ex-colonial kind of term, I think, you know, space becomes extremely significant. And I don't think it's possible to think about in a colonial world or a post-colonial world or an ex-colonial world about being occupying a different space. So I think the concept of the ex-colonial would have to be both temporal and spatial in its aspects, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question.
It feels like the question is more about how those are mediated than a simple whether or not.
Yeah. I guess also, you know, it's much more of a phenomenological conceptualization, ex-colonialism. It's you know, it's an experiential attitude or ethos, if you like, of critique to address to the present moment in the same way that Foucault talks about. So, you know, but that attitude or ethos, as I tried to explain in my presentation, is it's both physical and spiritual or mental, you know, so it's, you know, and being physical, it's bound up with space and with the relationships one has with the space and inner space and with the others that occupy one's space, just as much as it is a relationship to time and temporality and to the ancestors that come before and the generations that come after.
So we have a question from Olga for David in the chat, which I'll read. How does dowsing work in a high-rise building on top floors? Is it possible only on the ground? What about floor materials, walls, and ceilings? And then a specific follow-up, what if you have a robot like a Roomba in the space?
Well, as long as the Roomba doesn't have a laser, you're usually kind of okay. These geopathic stress lines extend up into essentially low Earth orbit. So and if one dug underground, they would be there as well. There's very little that seems to interrupt them from construction material, although there's a variety of different practices and substances that are used to change the nature of those particular subtle frequencies. So there's extensive sort of work done by a group of contemporary German physicians where they went to the homes of 5,000 people with cancer and determined that the cancer in something like 4,890 of the cases presented itself in the part of the body where the individual was, their bed was on a cross between geopathic stress lines. And so part of the, these reparative work was to move people off geopathic stress, but then also to, if that was impossible, to look at sort of changing the nature of that particular energetic expression.
And we have a question from Russell, if he wants to jump on screen.
Thank you, Mitch. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I apologize, it's another question for Simone, but also relating to Sarah's presentation. I'm just wondering, I was really struck, Simone, by your point about indigenous spirituality, spiritualities being not being coterminous with post-humanist ones, if only because the indigenous culture has never been humanist in the first place. But I'm wondering, if we look at a present tense example, Sarah's example of the Inuit video game, what does that do to that contention that Inuit spiritualities are not equivalent to or coterminous with post-humanist ones? I'm just wondering what happens when you have the mediation of a technology or a medium, video game, or for that, in my case, I would be interested. I work with Inuit cinema, so all of a sudden the terms, you're on the same playing field, right? Video games, cinema narratives, film fiction narrative, etc. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, thanks, good question. Look, I think I agree with you. So Sarah, you might want to jump in here as well, but I think that Sarah's example of the Inuit video games, I think that's both indigenous and post-humanist, in the sense that it sort of references a kind of post-humanist relationship to technology, or the relationship between human and technology. So my point was not so much that indigenous philosophies can't be post-humanist, but that when we think about the definition of indigenous philosophies as always being post-humanist, insofar as they've never been humanist, I think there's that's a sort of complication of temporality that I would find problematic. So my point was not so much that indigenous philosophies can't be post-humanist, but that when we reference indigenous philosophies in a post-humanist context, they're not the same thing. That's all. That's all I really meant by that. Sarah, did you have something to add?
Yeah, this is like a very interesting kind of question to me, I think, because I do struggle with the idea of fitting indigenous spirituality kind of into an indigenous model that is a Western kind of philosophy and everything. And the approach that I was kind of taking with my own research on like the video games and everything was that Kate Rigby, a religious studies scholar, she writes about how kind of new materialism and post-humanism can kind of bridge the gap between indigenous spirituality and kind of Western academia and kind of like our understandings there. So it can kind of offer a way to communicate between the two in new ways, and they can enrich one another in various ways. But I definitely agree with you, Simone, that I don't think that they are the same thing. I don't think that we can really say that there are post-human elements, but I don't think it's, the same.
Yeah, there is a tendency though, amongst certain post-humanist scholars to equate the two. And I think that's really problematic politically. So that would be something I would be quite careful to avoid myself. Did that answer your question, Russell?
Sorry, unmuting. Yes, very, very much so. I obviously the specific example of spiritualities of one kind or another broadens out into larger questions of indigeneity versus a humanist tradition and this kind of thing. And I absolutely agree with that. It is very productive, I think, to explore these questions through specific contemporary media examples, specific films or video games, where the indigenous cultural producers have made this choice to work with a non-indigenous technology in order to express that point of view, that indigenous point of view on things. So there's a meeting halfway, I suppose. There's a common language there, if nothing else.
Yeah, and indigenous cultures are fully contemporary as well. That's part of the political aspect of this discussion, I think, too.
Yeah, thank you.
So Ellington has a question for David. Can you speak more on a connection between geomancy and RFID radio waves that allow us to read the certain energy signatures of various devices?
Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was really great to have both Simone's and Sarah's presentations before mine, because they were already sort of auto-correcting and providing useful, productive framework around my obviously very sort of short remarks, Sarah's observations around the tendency for certain types of anti-technology romanticization in neopaganism. I wouldn't consider myself a neopagan, but a lot of neopagans will do this form of druidic energy practice, working with earth energies, for example. And then, of course, the discussion we've just had about that would qualify the statement that I began with Simondon about all spirituality being post-human. Well, that presumes a certain perspective of the adoption of liberal humanism is something that we're moving away from, when that obviously isn't always already the case. But so just to say that the broader sort of project that I'm working on looks at the ways in which there's an aporia in the literature around contemporary late capital's relation with technology. That many things from DNA to organ transplants to work around CRISPR with DNA, things to do around the ways in which biological and energetic practices, and if we think of media practices like notions like the attention economy or Lazzaretti's notion of semio-capital, there's a really rich panoply of theoretical engagements with the ways in which high capital and its technologies capture and extract surplus value and do the work of constructing and limiting subjectivities. The aporia, the hole in the literature, is the carrier frequency from that permits the signals that actually permit telecommunications devices to communicate amongst themselves. A lot of discussion of the object, but that's still a profoundly identitarian kind of way of thinking about things. So the publishing that I've done so far works around this notion of moving from the modular, that Foucault talks about with societies of discipline. Deleuze takes this up into the modular in a slightly more advanced way in his work around Postscript on societies of control. But there's a way in which the modularity of high frequency signals captures and entrains biological systems in a way that literature has thoroughly demonstrated. But like thalidomide, tobacco, any number of other industrial products over the last 75 years, that their deleterious effects have essentially been sort of suppressed by industry and industry's relationship with regulators. Similarly, we're going to see over the coming years more people talking about the unbeneficial or harmful or unhealthful effects of radio frequency technology, the actual vibrations that permit this. So I'm really interested in practices that precede, not for romantic reasons, but simply because they're around for a long time, technologies that precede advanced techno-capital that have to do with the management of energy, subtle energy, any number of sort of traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine from the South Asian tradition, or any number of other indigenous forms of medical practice that work with the subtle energy body. So I'm just really interested in seeing those as potential resources to, in some sense, counterbalance what is going to be a really significant ongoing onslaught of capture via techno-capital, via the waves of advanced radio frequency.
Julia asks a question in the chat. She says, this conversation is reminding me of Vanessa Watts's work on indigenous place thought and ontologies. What does it mean to take indigenous philosophies and spirituality seriously, but also critically, literally? So I guess that's for anyone, maybe Simone or Sarah.
Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself. So what does it mean to take indigenous philosophies, place-based philosophies seriously and critically? Well, I mean, I think that's bound up with the, for me, I'm talking about for myself, I think that's bound up with the idea of attitude or ethos as a kind of comportment of critique towards the present. So, you know, after colonialism, we tend in the West, in colonial locations, not to take indigenous philosophies seriously, not to take place-based philosophies seriously. And so I think that, you know, the critique of the genealogy that's led to that situation is part of an ethos of both post-humanism and decolonization for me. I think they go together as a way of learning how to listen seriously to indigenous place-based philosophies as a kind of resource for thinking about the condition of climate crisis, thinking about overutilization of resources, and also for thinking about what it means to exist sympathetically in connection to place. But at the same time, I think there's also a need not to appropriate those indigenous philosophies of place-based connection, because they belong to indigenous people who, you know, it's not possible for me to say I'm connected to this place in the same way that, you know, my Ghana friend is, my indigenous Ghana friend is, because, you know, she is of this place, whereas I just live in relation to this place. You know, it's not quite the same possibilities for both of us in the same way. That's my quick response to that. Sarah?
Yeah, I think you've said it really well, Dr. Bicknell. Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, there's a history of not taking indigenous philosophies seriously in academia and in science in particular as well. And I think that, you know, there is a lot that can be learned from indigenous philosophies. And I think that we are kind of moving in that direction in some ways. But again, like you said, we need to be careful of not appropriating and kind of treading that ground carefully and working with Indigenous knowledge keepers rather than kind of taking knowledge out of the context that it should be in.
And I will just add as well, because I'm thinking about a particular example, but early on in your talk, Simone, when you talked about the way in which Indigenous spirituality is very much tied into claims for sovereignty, that the political and the spiritual are entangled in an Indigenous cosmology or way of life, and it's manifested itself in an issue in the St. Catharines area near Brock on the Haudenosaunee-Anishinaabe territory, where the Haudenosaunee, through negotiation with the Crown, have gotten a hunting season opened in a provincial park near campus. And so the claim for land rights and sovereignty, which is exercised in the hunt, is tied up with a Haudenosaunee cosmology and spiritual belief that the deer that they hunt in the park willingly give themselves to the hunters to be consumed, to be killed and consumed. And so there's been a lot of tension in the community between folks that live in that area and have formed relationships with the deer, know the deers individually, and the deers come back to their land if they back up to the park year after year and they see their offspring and things. And so there's contestations over the land and how people know the deer or become into relationship with the deer. And it's also a disconnect or a tension between folks who have a philosophical or spiritual dispensation towards deer and maybe a Western idea that seems quite antithetical to the idea that an animal would willingly die for someone. So that's a way in which the spiritual enters the political and is inextricable in these types of nation-to-nation dialogues.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. That's very interesting. I think also it relates to the way sovereignty itself is understood. So I think, as a political philosopher, my work in posthumanism is focused quite intensely on understanding sovereignty in relational terms and what that might mean for our institutions. In Australia, we don't have treaty, for example. And I'm not saying that treaty is particularly effective for First Nations in Canada either, but certainly, the Western tradition of sovereignty is that it's unitary, it's exclusive, et cetera, et cetera. I think posthumanism as a basis for political philosophy for a non-Indigenous political thinker opens up the possibility of conceiving sovereignty in relational terms, and I think that's very productive and helpful. And if I may kind of engage in a kind of segue towards David's work on divination, I think, I don't know if you thought much about this, David, but, for me, Deleuze's idea of the divination of the forces comprising the event or constituting the event, the divination of the event, I think, and the dark precursor, the work on the idea that there's sort of relational agency required in bringing disparate forces into proximity so that they can engage in positive and mutually reciprocal and beneficial ways. Yeah. I think that's a kind of notion of divination that I think is extremely valuable, and it's something I've tried to sort of bring out in my own writing as well as a political philosophy, the importance of divination, of knowing the other intimately in order to understand how compatible associations might be formed and might be sustained as well. I think that's part of divination.
Precisely,
is the divination of forces. It has a political bearing that I think Maxwell might also find quite relevant in thinking about political theology as well.
Yeah, I'll just respond to that. Maxwell, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in. And the notion of the dark precursor really comes out in Difference in Repetition, when he's sort of working through this articulation of the virtual and the actual, and the ways in which they are sort of irrelated in the sense that they don't sort of replicate one another in different realms, but inhere within one another. But there is this moment of something that occurs that sparks, he uses notions of lightning, the zigzag, to talk about this sort of moment of triggering constitutionality, that then the evental moment. And so, thus perhaps his interest in Bergsonian intuition as a means and mode of proceeding, and that's my sort of invocation, I use the term advisedly, of gnoseology, right, where there's sort of an attentiveness to the somatic aspects of knowingness, but it does have an ethical bearing in part, as I understand it, because of its relationship with the notion of potentiality and the significance of potentiality within that virtual actual system as a place where the new can arise from, and where new unfolding complex relationalities can occur, and that provides the space or aperture within which new political arrangements and alliances can occur in a space that is seemingly deeply striated or deeply striated, and there's no room. The potential provides the opportunity to eventuate new arrangements which are potentially resistant to the capture which perhaps has preceded the forces that are held. And so this is why I'm quite comfortable, sharing what is essentially a practice in this philosophical or theoretical discussion, because I'm working to understand through my own work and the work of others who do this kind of work, what is that kind of threshold of event between the somatic, what we understand to be the somatic corporeal on one hand, and then the conceptual on the other. So, and in a way in which there's no logic of supremacy, where the concept dominates the event, because of course from a Deleuzian, Simondonian and back to Lucretius, and so, like, the concept itself is the result of an event as opposed to being something that's applied. So a resounding yes to the notion of the ethical bearing and then the political implications of that notion of divination. Thus his Deleuze's thinking around the sorcerer and all the ways in which that's been taken up by a lot of really rich specific feminist philosophy since Deleuze and Guattari were writing. Thanks for the prompt.
So we have some other questions in the chat, but before we go to that, Francesca has a question. So if she wants to pop on her video and ask that.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Mitch, David, Maxwell, Sarah,
Hi.
everyone. It's great to be together. Thanks for organizing this amazing event. So I've been thinking a lot about these topics, especially after COVID-19 hit, the whole planet. And, when it first started, it came as a surprise in the sense that, we were kind of not ready for a pandemic. And then it came, at least in the US, everything very fast. And I had to reconsider everything about myself. All of a sudden, everyone who I loved could have died tomorrow, myself included. And of course, I started to think about academia, posthumanism, and I looked deeply into that. And first of all, I must say that I was happy with posthumanism because it did help me navigate in this situation, more kind of an existential posthumanism of the interconnection with everyone, kind of understanding our role in the pandemic. But then, of course, a question that came when I got into more of a spiritual approach to life. I started to implement meditation in every day to give me some, serenity. And I started to realize that a lot of traditions of spirituality really criticize a life that is focusing on notion. And this goes very well with what David was saying, this idea of concepts and being in intellectual mind, to the point that meditation is actually silencing the intellectual mind to allowing for the universe to open to us. So my question at the point that I love academia, and I've been in academia for so many years, and I believe in academia, but I wonder if kind of we are addicted to the intellectual mind. And this is something that we were talking already at Brock University last February when we had this beautiful event all together, and we were trying to think more of a practice of posthumanism. And some of you came with excellent ideas about how to teach posthumanism. So in that sense, do you think that there are practices that we can implement as posthumanists in the way we teach, in the way we write? And are we addicted to our mind?
Great question.
I mean, yeah, lovely question. At the risk of reiterating too much, I'll just say, Francesca, that the work of this sort of practice that I've been doing for a long time, that I've talked a bit about today, for me has forced me to ask a lot of those kinds of questions about what constitutes a practice and what constitutes a theorization. I often go back to I think it's in that collection on, it's both in a Foucault and in a Deleuze collection, but it's about intellectuals and power. And they both sort of, Foucault and Deleuze come up with this notion of these relays back and forth between the intellectual and the practical, and problematize the notion of practice as not being inherently kind of informed by concepts. So perhaps, I obviously sort of approach things from this energetic work or my work as an artist with in performance and with theater practitioners. But presumably, there are a whole range of different comparable practices where the interconnections, the problematizations of boundaries that happen through an increased intensification of this notion of relays back and forth between, and that frequently mutually inhere and perhaps are happening with a certain type of simultaneity between practice and the work of the intellect. Presumably there's lots of different ways forward that can be brought into research and teaching and learning, and also research, communication, transmission moments.
Thank you, David.
I will say as well, just relatedly, Francesca, it's quite interesting because shortly before the onset of the pandemic, during the pandemic, this past summer, I read Rosie's new book, Posthuman Knowledge, where she speaks a lot about the post-human condition in affective terms, and the need to work up one's endurance to maintain, in light of in response to this affective overload in our post-human times. And it seems like it just became exponentially greater during the pandemic, and the way in which one needs to, in a Spinoza's sense, craft some endurance and novel modes of endurance, complex modes of endurance through human and technological relations and things. But the role of the affective response to the pandemic with, the move towards online learning, and all of that has been really great. The pressure has been really great, and the amount of affective responses. Rosie talks about the constant bringing together of all these very powerful forces. So we have the pandemic, and then we have a hard winter, and the move to online gradient stuff, and just the affective intensity of that, I think is, these sort of meta questions that are raised by feminist science technology studies, for example, these ontological questions lend themselves to a spiritual orientation as well. So like you said, coming to this idea that everyone could be dead, I think that was running through a lot of our minds last March, that it leads itself to ask some of these spiritual questions. And if we're working within posthumanism, what can posthumanism tell us spiritually? So that's part of the impetus for me, definitely, to start asking some of these questions.
Well said.
Thank you, Mitch.
So I have I'm wondering, Mitch, if you could talk to us a little bit about where you are going to bring. So in your narrative, you'd sort of reached a point where I just became quite curious about what the next steps for the convergence of some of these notions are. Would you mind expanding a little bit on sort of where you plan on taking this sort of stage conversation between these theorists a bit further?
Well, I'm not sure, because you see folks like Bennett and Berardi and Simone, I'll lump Simone in here, who are in that Spinozist Deleuzian tradition, which is spirituality broadly conceived, but not theology proper. And so then you have Maxwell, who's dealing with some of that theology proper. You have Sarah, who I think is dealing with some of that theology proper. And so those seem to be two strains and two responses to a desire for enchantment. So Bennett says enchantment is not only perceiving reality as, for her, a politics of enchantment is not only seeing reality as enchanted, but working effectively to create instances of enchantment. The feeling of enchantment, which is brought out in an interrelational manner. And so through posthumanism, I think the dominant strain would be the post-secular that doesn't deal with theology proper, in many ways, because theology has all of those issues with hierarchy and things of that nature that some of the speakers discussed. But then you have Barad, who has a book project forthcoming, which is an expansion of her work with Benjamin, which deals with theology proper in the form of Judaism and Kabbalah and things like that. And I think you have, to Maxwell's presentation, a lot of political theology and process theology and things like that that can be really very, very fruitful for posthumans. So I don't know how much overlap there could be with those two streams. Well, it definitely seems that through a diffractive methodology like Barad, she seems quite content with putting these unruly, things together and to see what flashes up.
I'm wondering if one way of thinking about them is the distinction that's drawn in a lot of this literature between the transcendent and the transcendental, right? So from a theological perspective, the sort of predisposition to think to assume that which is foundational is also originary. But from a lot of the kind of Deleuzian style, sort of more recent ontological work, the transcendental is that which ends up becoming foundational but isn't necessarily originary. It doesn't make that claim, but it still has a valence, a duration, a quality of sustainability that makes it a potent force. So I'm wondering then, if there's ways of having sort of theological approaches that are aware of the constructedness of their own origins, but nonetheless through an act of suspension of disbelief or creative fabulation decide to for purposes of a sort of strategic essentialism or strategic agentialism, just sort of like buy into that particular kind of component, even though there's a recognition of the constructedness or inventedness of its origins.
Right. Well, to Sarah's point, that's a dominant strain in Neopaganism as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this relatively new religion from the mid-20th century, but they have origin stories and mythology that date back to time immemorial.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a transition from trying to sort of find archaeological proof to verify these origin stories to a more recent shift to say, well, they might not be historically true, but they have meaning and they have a meaning that makes them true or in some ways meaningful to our tradition. So you see that play out in the Neopagan example.
Precisely.
Yeah, I was very curious, maybe Sarah, if you want, you can say a bit more about this, and this comes from my ignorance. But I'm very curious, not being familiar with Neopagan traditions, what exactly the term neo does there. Like what kind of part of my work is, thinking critically about temporal and historical forms of sovereignty, which are often expressed by appeals to origins or appeals to ends. I just wanted to as a side note, been reading a great book by Mark Rifkin called Beyond Settler Time. And this is something I'm trying to think about more. We often think of sovereignty in very spatial senses, but Rifkin helps me think, and others help me think about sovereignty in temporal forms. And so I've been hearing in our presentations a lot of appeals to origins. And to me, I feel very ambivalent about that. I think this can be done in very generative and connective and relational ways. Or, Adorno says somewhere that the appeal to origins is fascist. I think that's in against epistemology. And, it's obviously a term that, everything needs to be unpacked there. But I'm curious about the neo in Neopagan. And I don't know, Sarah, does that spur anything for you?
Right, yeah. Well, the Neopagan is used academically more so than the people who actually practice the tradition. It's kind of just to distinguish it from like paganism, like Celtic paganism, Norse paganism, pre-Christian religions. But pagans themselves don't call themselves neopagans for the most part. So when I typically write about neopagans, I'll usually use the word pagan because that's what they identify with. And there's a lot of different kind of views on connections with the past within paganism. So there is a kind of revivalist tradition where people are really trying to kind of recreate as historically accurately kind of as possible what the kind of religious practices and rituals would have been, even though there's so much that we don't know about that. They kind of try to kind of create that as much as possible. And then there are, I think, most pagans probably kind of recognize that there is this gap in time that we can't have this kind of essential connection with the past in that way. So most do kind of recognize that. But the book that you bring up also is a really interesting text, Beyond Settler Time by Rifkin. And I think that shows us how I think maybe Indigenous traditions have different ways of thinking about time and different ways of understanding the past and everything. And Dr. Bignall already kind of mentioned this about how it's not like linear time, it's more like spiraling time, or kind of overlapping of past, present, and future in certain ways. So yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. That makes me think of, so at the end of my book project, I hit some problems with the contemporary temporal experience. So on one hand, we have thinkers who say we're accelerating, right? That the time is moving faster. And then on the other hand, you have someone like Byung-Chul Han in his book, The Scent of Time, who says, our ability to track time is disintegrating. So it's not like time is moving faster or slowing down, but our ability to mark it is fading. So I see these tensions, whether our problem is acceleration or kind of temporal decay. At the end of the day, there is this desire, as one of you said, this desire for enchantment, and so the next question becomes how to still, have some sense of meaning and meaningfulness and enchantment, but without falling back into those problems of hierarchy and dominance that we were discussing as well. And so where I turn, and I don't know if, I'm still thinking about this, where I turn is to Eric Auerbach's work, where he still insists in his big book, Mimesis, that he still insists that we draw connections between past and present, between figures, big figures, and fulfillments. But I think he does so in a way that's not so linear or causal and not so subjected to capture. David, as you were saying, that Deleuzian image of the control society. So I don't know, are there other ways that post-human ways of, insisting on meaning without those power problems?
It's interesting.
Your relationality, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for invoking Auerbach. I haven't thought about that book for a while. But the notion of mimesis, on one hand, being Platonic copy, which presumes supremacy and hierarchy and degradation versus purification. And then some of the more recent theorizations that sort of look at the emergence of being as, from philosophical perspective, is not coming out of the work of necessarily negating the other in order to have a consciousness, a self. And perhaps there's something in there around the sort of non-supremacy of certain ontological perspectives that aren't predicated on degradation and degradation versus purity, or the annihilation of the other, as as a certain kind of reading of Hegel, might invite us to think through. So what are those? And so a lot of work and thinking. I'm thinking Masumi's work on analogy, on Simondo's work on transduction. I think there's a whole lot of other contemporary writing that looks at these kinds of relationalities that don't have a supremacy logic built into their origin story.
So this is where the book project that I'm working on connects with some of my dissertation work. At the conclusion of my dissertation, I'm working on how Derrida's Violence and Metaphysics, this early essay on Levinas, and how the works of certain pacifist theologians in Mennonite and Anabaptist traditions, and how the work of Grace Jansen, who's this feminist philosopher of religion, each of them in their own way have this great challenge to exactly what you're talking about. And Jansen calls it displacement, right? This notion that we think a thing and it has to be thought at the expense of another thing. That this ontology where indifference is inherently competitive and plays out in these zero-sum terms. And I think there are paradoxes to that where even in our desire to be relational and non-displacing, we can reinscribe that. We can so easily become normative, and in our desire to make our normativity compulsory. And so I think close attention to small rhetorical uses of force or coercion. I mean, that seems to, I see that playing out in our discussions about relationality as well. We want to hold things open, but that can be reified really quickly.
Micro encouragements as opposed to microaggressions, right?
So I think we have to leave it there. Thank you everyone for coming. This will be posted on our YouTube page shortly if you want to share it with anyone. We'll have future roundtables and future events soon. Hopefully they'll be virtual for a while. If you want to friend us on Facebook or follow our website, or
we've got
Twitter.
A great TikTok channel, let me tell you.
Right, or our TikTok forthcoming. But thanks everyone for coming, and have a good evening, or Simone, have a good day.
Thank you.
And hopefully
thanks everybody.
Soon.
Thank you, Mitch. Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, Mitch. Yeah, lovely stuff.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much.